I have spent the last 200 years signing my name to a lie. Not a large lie. Not the kind that gets discussed in council chambers or debated in formal hearings. A small, precise, technical lie buried in the language of a single classification document, repeated in every renewal filing, every budget review, every internal memo for 2 full centuries. The document is called the Soul System Containment Directive. It describes the reason the human system was sealed behind a quarantine field shortly after first contact. It describes humanity as, and I am quoting the exact language because I have read it more times than I can count, an unpredictable and biologically aggressive variable in the galactic community. It says the seal exists to protect the galaxy from humanity. Before I continue with what actually happened, I want to ask you something, because if you have been watching channels like this one, you already know the shape these stories usually take, and you are probably expecting me to tell you that was a cover story for fear of human military strength. It was not. If you want to understand exactly what we were protecting humanity from for 200 years, and what humanity has been quietly protecting us from in return, without ever being told the real reason, stay with me. Subscribe now if you have not, because the second half of this report is going to recontextualize everything I just said, and I do not want you to miss it. I am Dr. Vesh Kalarin. I am a senior xenopathologist with the Concordance Biological Containment Authority. I helped write the first draft of that directive 200 years ago when I was young, frightened, and certain I was doing the responsible thing. I have spent every year since learning exactly how wrong I had the danger, while being completely right about the necessity of the seal. This is my full account. I am filing it because the seal comes down in 6 months, and I believe humanity deserves to know what we actually saw 200 years ago on the day we decided never to tell them the truth. The first concordance survey vessel to reach the Sol system was a vessel called the Quiet Current, a biological and ecological survey ship with a crew of 11, of which I was the most junior member. Our mandate was simple: observe, catalogue, assess habitability and biological risk before any formal contact protocol began. This was standard procedure for any newly detected system with confirmed life signatures. We had done this assessment on 31 worlds before Earth. We expected Earth to be the 32nd. We began with standard atmospheric and biological sampling from high orbit, spectral analysis, remote biomass surveys, the kind of work that, on every previous world, produced a clean and predictable picture within the first week. Earth did not produce a clean picture. I remember the exact moment the first anomaly appeared on my console, because I remember thinking it was an equipment malfunction. Our biomass survey instruments are calibrated to detect biological density across a logarithmic scale. Because biological density across known worlds varies by orders of magnitude, but rarely by more than 3 or 4 orders within a single planetary survey. Earth's instrument readings did not fit on our scale. I do not mean they registered at the high end. I mean the instrument's calibration assumptions broke. The software, designed to handle the densest biospheres we had previously catalogued, returned an error indicating the input values exceeded expected parameters by a margin the system was not designed to process. I recalibrated the instrument 3 times. I assumed operator error. I assumed sensor degradation from the transit. I assumed, frankly, anything other than the truth, because the truth did not fit anything I had been trained to expect. The truth was that a single square kilometre of Earth's tropical biosphere contained more distinct biological organisms, more species of bacteria, fungi, insects, plants, and microscopic life than our entire survey database had catalogued across 31 previously assessed worlds combined. 1 square kilometre. Combined, our mission commander, a careful and unflappable woman named Director Senna Vask, reviewed my data for 6 hours before she said anything at all. Then she said, "Run it again. Different equipment. Different location." We ran it again. Different equipment. Different location. The numbers were worse.
I need to explain something about biological development that most species in the concordance do not think about, because most species in the concordance have never had reason to. Complexity in biology is expensive. A complex organism, something with specialized organs, an immune system, a nervous system, a brain, requires enormous energy investment and is fragile in ways that simple organisms are not. A bacterium can mutate and adapt in hours. A complex animal takes generations to adapt to anything. This means that on most worlds, the relationship between complex life and simple life follows a predictable pattern. Simple life bacteria, viruses, basic parasites tends to outcompete complex life over evolutionary timescales because simple life is cheaper to run and faster to adapt. This is why most biospheres in the Concordance's catalogue are what we classify as evolutionarily frugal. Life exists, but it exists carefully. Slowly, in narrow, stable niches where the arms race between complexity and parasitism has settled into something close to a truce, because an all-out war between complex life and the microscopic world usually ends with complexity losing. We had seen this pattern on every world we had surveyed before Earth. Some worlds had more complex life than others. Some had less. But the pattern held everywhere. Frugal life, careful life, life that had learned, collectively and instinctively, not to push too hard against the microscopic world that could end it in a season. Earth had not learned that lesson. Or rather, and this is the part that took us several months of horrified analysis to properly understand, Earth had learned a different lesson entirely. Earth's complex life had not retreated from the arms race against parasites and pathogens. It had not settled into careful frugality. It had fought back. For approximately 4 billion years, continuously, every defense mechanism we catalogued in Earth's complex organisms, immune systems, inflammatory responses, fever, the specific molecular signaling that allows a body to identify and destroy a threat it has never encountered before, was not a passive adaptation. It was an active, escalating, continuously refined weapon system, locked in permanent combat with a microscopic world that was, by every other standard in the Concordance's database, supposed to have already won. It had not won. Earth's complex life had matched it. Generation after generation, species after species, in an arms race so old and so intense that by the time intelligent life emerged on that planet, every single organism walking, swimming, or flying across its surface was the descendant of 4 billion years of uninterrupted biological warfare. And then, on top of that foundation, evolution produced something that had never been seen before in the Concordance's recorded history. A species whose immune system was not merely adequate, a species whose immune system was, by any reasonable external measure, absurd.
I want to describe the moment we obtained our first human biological sample because I have given this account many times in many classified briefings, and I have never once told it the way I am about to tell it now, without the careful institutional language that strips the actual fear out of it. We did not make formal contact during the survey phase. This was standard protocol. We observed from orbit, and on 3 occasions we conducted discrete, non-invasive sampling near human population centers using methods that should have been completely undetectable. Our 3rd sampling attempt was discovered, not through any failure of our equipment. A human researcher, a field biologist working in a remote location for entirely unrelated reasons, happened to be present at the sampling site and noticed our drone. I want to be clear about what happened next, because the human response to this discovery became, unintentionally, one of the most important pieces of data we collected during the entire survey. The researcher did not panic. She did not flee. She did not attempt to destroy or capture the drone. She approached it, examined it with what our recordings show was genuine scientific curiosity, and then, and this is the detail that mattered most, she left a sample of her own. A small vial, deliberately placed beside our drone, containing what we later identified as a culture of a common human bacterial pathogen. She had understood, correctly, that we were conducting biological sampling. And her response, without any communication, without any shared language, without any way of knowing whether we would ever understand the gesture, was to offer a sample in return. It was, by every diplomatic standard we use across the concordance, an extraordinarily generous and trusting act. It was also the most dangerous biological sample our survey program had ever brought back to a containment facility, and we did not understand why for 3 more months. The vial reached our orbital research station 40, 1 day after collection. Standard procedure for any newly acquired biological sample is containment at the highest available biosafety tier until full characterization is complete. We followed this procedure exactly. The sample was sealed, the lab was sealed, and a small team, myself included, began the characterization process. On day 3 of analysis, a containment failure occurred. I want to be precise about what kind of failure, because the word containment failure tends to summon an image of explosions and emergency evacuations, and what actually happened was much quieter and much more frightening. A seal on one of the sample containers degraded faster than our safety margins anticipated. This is not, by itself, an unusual event. Every biological containment system in the concordance is built with multiple redundant barriers precisely because individual seals sometimes fail faster than projected. The failure of one seal is supposed to be survivable, even routine, because the next layer of containment exists specifically for this scenario. The pathogen reached the 2nd containment layer. It reached the 2nd containment layer because it had already, in the 3 days since collection, mutated at a rate our monitoring equipment had not been calibrated to track. 3 days. A mutation rate that, on every pathogen we had previously catalogued across 31 worlds, would have taken weeks or months to produce comparable variation. This is the part of the report that I have rewritten more times than any other section, because I am still, after 200 years, uncertain how to convey the specific quality of fear that I felt in that laboratory. It was not fear of the pathogen escaping and killing us. It was fear of what the pathogen represented. Because the human researcher who left us that sample had not given us a weapon. She had given us an ordinary, unremarkable bacterial infection, the human equivalent, we later learned, of a common and treatable childhood illness. And that ordinary illness, in 3 days, in a sealed containment laboratory, had already begun adapting to its new environment with a speed and aggression that exceeded every threat assessment in our database. I remember turning to Director Vask and asking her the question that, in hindsight, defined the next 200 years of concordance policy regarding humanity. I asked her, what does their immune system have to be capable of to survive being host to this, routinely, their entire lives? She did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice was very quiet. She said, I think we need to stop asking what humans can do to us. She said, I think we need to start asking what their bodies have already survived every single day for their entire existence as a species without considering it remarkable. The formal threat assessment that followed took 11 months to complete. I will summarize its conclusions as clearly as I can, because the classified version of this document is 40,000 words long, and the unclassified version that humanity was eventually shown contains none of what I am about to tell you. Human biology. Across every system we examined immune response, cellular repair, pathogen adaptation resistance, wound healing, inflammatory regulation operated at a level of aggressive capability that exceeded every other species in the Concordance's biological catalogue by a margin our own classification systems were not designed to express. This was not a weapon humans had built. This was not a capability humans had developed deliberately or even understood themselves, in the way they understood their technology or their military doctrine. It was the baseline condition of their species, the ordinary, unremarkable biological inheritance of 4 billion years of uninterrupted evolutionary warfare on a planet that had never once allowed its complex life the luxury of frugal, careful, sustainable biology. We ran the projections that every responsible containment authority is required to run in this situation. What happens if human biological material, not weaponized, not deliberately engineered, simply ordinary human biological material, is introduced into a concordance biosphere that has spent its entire evolutionary history practicing careful frugality specifically, because it never needed to develop defenses against anything like this? The projections were not survivable. Not survivable for the receiving biosphere. Not survivable, potentially, for any biosphere within the concordance that lacked Earth's 4 billion years of evolutionary preparation. I want to be completely clear about what this means, because I believe the distinction matters enormously and has been lost in every public account of this period. We did not seal the Sol system because we were afraid of human weapons. We did not seal it because we were afraid of human ships or human military doctrine or human ambition. We sealed it because an uncontrolled human presence in galactic space, human colonists, human trade, human biological material moving freely between worlds represented, by our own projections, an extinction-level contamination risk to every biosphere in the concordance that had not spent 4 billion years preparing for what humanity's bodies considered ordinary. We were not protecting the galaxy from humanity's strength. We were protecting the galaxy's children from humanity's normal. Director Vask made the decision, with the full authority of the Concordance Biological Containment Board behind her, that this finding could never be communicated to humanity directly. I argued against this decision at the time. I was young, and I believed, naively, that humanity deserved the truth, however difficult. I understand her reasoning now in a way I could not at 26 years old. Consider what it would mean to tell an entire species, newly contacted, still learning that they were not alone in the universe, that their own bodies, the ordinary biological inheritance every human being carries without choosing, it were considered by the rest of the galaxy to be a planetary-scale biological hazard. Consider what that knowledge does to a species' relationship with itself. Consider the despair, the shame, the impossible question of what a species is supposed to do with the knowledge that simply existing, simply being born, simply living an ordinary human life makes them something the rest of the universe has had to quarantine. So we wrote the directive differently. We told humanity, through the careful diplomatic channels established in the decades following first contact, that the Sol system was sealed because humanity had been assessed as biologically aggressive and militarily unpredictable. We let them believe, we allowed an entire species to believe, for 200 years that they were being contained, because the galaxy feared their strength. It was a lie that humanity could carry with something like pride. Fear of strength is, in its own strange way, a compliment. It suggests power. It suggests capability. It is a story a species can tell itself without despair. The truth that they were sealed away not because of what they could choose to do, but because of what their bodies simply were at the most fundamental biological level, without any choice or intention involved at all, was a story we did not believe any species should have to carry. So we let them be feared instead of pitied. We let them build their identity around being dangerous, when the truth was closer to being unintentionally, biologically miraculous, in a way that happened to be catastrophic for everyone else. I have wondered, across 200 years, whether that was the right choice. I still do not fully know. The seal comes down in 6 months. 200 years of containment research has produced what the Concordance Biological Standards Office is calling, in suitably bureaucratic language, a viable mutual exposure protocol, a graduated framework for introducing human biological contact to the wider galaxy slowly enough and with enough protective preparation on both sides, that the catastrophic projections from our original threat assessment no longer apply. It took 2 centuries. It took thousands of researchers across dozens of worlds. It took humanity's own medical and biological institutions, once they were finally read into a heavily redacted version of the truth 40 years ago, contributing solutions that our own scientists had not considered, because humans understood their own biology, their own relationship with their own immune systems, in ways that we, as outside observers, never could. I have spent considerable time in the writing of this report thinking about what I actually want humanity to understand, now that the seal is finally ending and the full truth is finally being declassified. I do not want them to feel afraid of themselves. I do not want the species that built medicine, that fought its own diseases for 10,000 years of recorded history before ever meeting another intelligent species, to learn that the rest of the galaxy spent 2 centuries afraid of their bodies and respond to that knowledge with shame. I want them to understand something else entirely. For 4 billion years, on a single small planet, life refused to surrender to the microscopic world that conquers every other biosphere we have ever catalogued. It did not retreat into careful frugality. It did not settle for the narrow, stable, sustainable truce that every other complex biosphere in the Concordance eventually negotiated with its own parasites and pathogens. It fought, generation after generation, species after species, for 4 billion years, without ever knowing it was doing anything remarkable. Without ever knowing there was an audience watching from beyond the sky, without ever knowing that the very fact of its survival would one day be classified by an entire galactic civilization as something almost too dangerous to be believed. And at the end of all that fighting, it produced a species that looked up at the stars and wondered what was out there. completely unaware that the answer included an authority quietly assessing whether their continued existence in its current unaltered form was safe to release into a universe that had, by comparison, given up the fight a very long time ago. I do not think humanity should be ashamed of what their bodies are. I think humanity should understand that they are the proof of something the rest of us had stopped believing was possible. That you do not have to surrender to survive. That 4 billion years of refusing to lose produces something the universe has no adequate name for and no adequate defense against, and ultimately, no choice but to learn to live beside. The seal comes down in 6 months. I will be there when it does. I think, after 200 years of carrying this particular truth alone, I would like to be the one who finally tells them not that they were feared, but that they were extraordinary, in a way none of us had a framework for, and that the framework we built instead. The lie we told to spare them the weight of the real answer was never about protecting the galaxy from a threat. It was about giving a species time to grow into a truth large enough to carry without breaking. End of report. Dr. Vesh Kalarin, Senior Xenopathologist, Concordance Biological Containment Authority. Filed for declassification alongside the closure of the Sol System Containment Directive, 200 years after I helped write the lie it was built on. If you believe that the deepest truths sometimes take centuries to be ready to hear, subscribe to Ironheart HFY. We are just getting started.